carnival-like atmosphere has turned to one of anger and resentment. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Ayman Mokyeldin, who's live in Cairo, who can tell us, what are they chanting, Ayman?
Well, they've been saying the slogan that has come to symbolize the demands of the people. In Arabic, it is Huwa yamshi, which means he must leave or he shall leave. And certainly that is not what has happened this evening. So you can get a sense of the anger or perhaps the motivation now in these calls being resonating so loudly.
What did you make of what you heard in the President's speech?
Well, certainly a president who was once again offering minor concessions to the protesters. You know, it started off with the tone that he has been using, as he has been in so many of his speeches over the past several days and years, that of a father speaking to his children. It is, by many people's assessments, very patronizing, a very patronizing speech, because he starts off by talking to them as his children, is what he says. And in this speech, we see a president who's very much still entrenched in the notion that he will hold on to power. Again, he made reference to the military service that he has had. He says one of his proudest moments was raising the flag over Egypt, and in essence trying to draw again on the emotional sympathy that Egyptians have for the military, and emotional sympathy Egyptians have for the wars and sacrifices that have been made by those in the armed forces. And in essence, the president once again trying to make that emotional appeal that he is a person who has tried to serve the country, tried to serve the interests of the country. So the tone of it, on one hand, very seen from a point of view of patronage, but at the same time, again, seeing some very minor concessions in terms of some of these constitutional amendments. You know, when you look at the list of the amendments that the president was talking about, perhaps the two most important ones, 76 and 77, have to deal with the way the president is nominated, and more importantly, having to say term limits being set for the presidency. We also heard him make reference to canceling Article 179, which is the basis of the emergency law that's enshrined in the Egyptian constitution. So you get a sense really that the president is not saying anything new, because we've already known that these amendments were a source of contention. We knew that the Constitutional Committee that was appointed by the president a few days ago was essentially revising these amendments. So anyone that was expecting the president to deliver a historic speech will certainly find that tonight's comments are a bit disappointing. They did not go so far in delivering what the people and the protesters have been demanding. Perhaps another interesting point out of that speech was the delegation of Vice President Omar Suleiman of some of the executive authorities or some of the executive powers that the president has traditionally held, but not an all-right or all-out transfer of power to anyone else other than the presidency.
We were talking, Ayman, before the president spoke about the celebrations in Tahrir Square, which we said may have been premature, but all the signs were that something historic was going to happen today. What went wrong? Have we misread the signs somehow? Have we misread the signs somehow?
Well, you know, the first sign that is going to have to be questioned very closely is the indication that came out from the armed forces. You know, the armed forces in Egypt rarely give out statements, rarely convene these types of sessions that we saw today from the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the senior leadership. It is going to be very interesting in the coming hours, in the coming days, as to why that statement, why those images were broadcast. What was the message? Could there be a behind the scenes, a dynamic that is at play here that is still not settled entirely? And I think we're going to find out more about that in the coming hours, because as you mentioned, the indications that were coming out from people within the government, you know, the Secretary General of the ruling party, the ruling National Democratic Party, Hossein Badrawi, on the record saying that he expects President Hosni Mubarak to answer the demands of the people by Friday. Also, Egyptian state media, the Ahram newspaper, quoted Hossein Badrawi. So the indications were not they were founded on solid grounds. I mean, there is reason to believe that Egypt was on the cusp of something historic, but the president's statement certainly did not live up to the billing that was being leaked by official news agencies as well as the Egyptian military itself. I can tell you one thing that this is definitely going to do. It is going to mobilize protesters tomorrow, that's for sure, because you can hear the reaction in the background, the anger and the demands and the calls of those protesters a mile away can be heard from Liberation Square. So if anyone is doubting about what's going to happen tomorrow, you can certainly anticipate that these comments are going to mobilize a great deal of protesters.